For me, a good story will be one about someone who starts out opposite to where he ends up or she ends up and takes a journey that's meaningful to get there.
We are trying to make people feel something, whether it's movies, television, anything. That's the goal. You're not educating people. You may do those things in addition to moving people, but your job as a screenwriter, and the screenwriters are the first filmmakers, your job is to make people feel something. So you're in the emotion manufacturing business and the distribution of that emotion. That's what we do. That's our job. The contract we make with the audience is they pay us money in the form of a box office ticket or in the form of paying their cable bill or their streaming app bill. And in return, we make them feel something. That's our contract with them. They don't even necessarily know it. If you ask them, they probably wouldn't necessarily describe it, the audience, that way. But it is that. It could be laughter, it could be tears, it could be being scared, it could be having your pulse racing with excitement, it could be getting turned on, but it's something that makes them feel something. That's the relationship between the filmmaker, the screenwriter, and the audience. Our job is not to just express ourselves. If you just want to, if you write down your innermost thoughts and feelings on a piece of paper, that's therapy. But if you do it in such a way so that someone else can read it and feel what you feel, that's art. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. That part of the process gets forgotten a lot, especially now, when it seems like just expressing emotion should be enough. No, it's not. If the audience didn't feel it, it doesn't matter. The audience is the completion of the arc in any art form, but especially a popular art form like movies. Until an audience feels it and responds to it, you haven't completed your task. And they will leave the theater frustrated if they haven't had that experience. Our job is to make them feel something, not for us to express what we feel. In order to make them feel something, yes, very often you do have to tap into something that you feel deeply and get it on the screen. When I write television, I'm doing the same thing. I'm just not necessarily, I may be using someone else's characters or someone else's scenario, but I have to find something in that story that I can feel strongly about and then try to get that on the screen. But my job is to communicate it to the audience, not just to feel it, not just to express it.
And what a logline is, for those that don't know, is it's basically a one-sentence summarization of your script idea, but what it's really trying to do is show us what the central concept is and the central conflict that the hero is going to be facing and what's at stake and what are the antagonistic forces that they're facing. And all of that has to come in one sentence. And basically, its purpose is to convince people to read your script, really. I use it for two reasons. Number one, I write a logline of every script that I'm going to write before I write it. And what it helps me do is, number one, put in a very succinct way what it is that I'm setting out to do, so that when I'm writing and I get lost in the weeds of Act 2 or something, I can always come back to it and see what my intention was and see perhaps where I've lost my way, because the logline is the North Star. It tells us exactly what this is, where we're going, and what we should expect. So it's creative for me on that respect. I also use it as a vetting mechanism because I like to test my ideas out on people that I can trust. I don't just come up with an idea and go secretly to my closet and write it. No, you should be unafraid of your idea. You should be unafraid to test it with as many people. Test it with the gardener, test it with somebody in the elevator, it doesn't matter. But use your logline as a way to test your idea. What do you think of this? And you just give them, it takes 30 seconds out of their day to either go, oh, or huh? And based on the responses you get, you know whether you're onto something, right? So it's good for that. I call that idea vetting, right? And so the idea is obviously the most critical component of selling a screenplay to a Hollywood studio. I mean, it's more important than the dialogue, it's more important than the characters, it's more important than the themes, it's more important than your excellence in crafting scenes. Because all of those things amount to nothing if the concept is not marketable and appeals to the masses. If it doesn't have some quality that is so profoundly evocative that captures your imagination, That's why somebody, they spend a lot of money, buying these scripts and then putting millions of dollars into these budgets to make these movies. It's not a small thing. It's a big enterprise. You got to think that you're basically going into business with these studios to create something, right? And so you damn well better be delivering them something that is incredibly fresh and interesting and compelling. And so the idea is king.
The logline is the map. It's the through line, it's the space that I think guides everything. And I certainly know in the playwriting world, there's lots of opportunity, and I've done this and do it sometimes myself, where I come up with a character and I just start writing, or I come up with a small circumstance. But what I've learned in the TV world is, without knowing who the central character is, what they're trying to do, and what they're up against, those three things which I think need to be in every log line, then a piece will just sort of ramble. It'll just sort of become this kind of thesis of a character's opinion, or it just won't feel galvanizing for an audience. And so the log line, that sort of central thought, that central idea crystallized in language, is an essential piece to hold on to, I think, when creating anything dramatic. My favorite logline formula is, this is a story about blank, who's trying to blank in spite of blank. And so again, you get who that protagonist is, and you can fill in other stuff, not only their name, but some relevant detail about who they are in the world, or how they come across, or where they are in their lives. Who is trying to or struggling to blank, which is about what they're trying to get done. Like, what's the goal of this person? Where are they headed? What are they trying to achieve? And then in spite of X. And there could be several X's. There could be a person, there could be a circumstance, there could be a physical ailment, there could be a mental impairment, there could be something as big as the end of the world. But as long as you have those three elements, the person, what they're trying to do, what they're up against, then I think you've got a good spine for creating something interesting. And I think one of the reasons people find the logline challenging is that we're all used to the TV Guide logline. The TV Guide logline is much more diffuse, and it's much more to sort of bring in an audience. It's not necessarily a tool for a screenwriter. So you'll see in the TV Guide logline, something about, this is a story about the 1950s and a group of people who, are discovering themselves amid the backdrop of blah, blah, blah. Well, that doesn't really tell me who it's about, which I always think comes down to primarily one person. It doesn't tell me anything about what they're trying to do. It tells me a lot about the atmosphere, and it doesn't tell me anything about the obstacle. So I think often when people step into the space of writing for the first time, or even those of us who've been doing it for a while, it's really important to remind ourselves to crystallize it down to those particular elements, so that we have a through line and that we really know what we're doing, hopefully thematically, and on every page of our script from beginning to end. It's a really great guidepost to have. If I am writing something for TV, I will always write a logline before I write a TV piece. I think in my process of writing plays, it can be different. I have started with characters talking, or circumstances where two people meet and they start talking. And then at some point, though, I'll realize when I get to sort of a space of diminishing returns, that I need to know more, sort of as the god of that universe, like what's really going on. And then I will back up and I will say, okay, which of these characters is the protagonist, and what exactly are they trying to do, and what is in their way. And so I always come back to a logline if I don't start with one, but in the TV world, I always start with one. And I certainly, if I'm in the rare instance, which actually happens a lot here in LA, where I'm pitching a project that I haven't written, the logline absolutely comes first, because I need to be able to crystallize it in order to sell it to a buyer or to communicate to somebody what it is I'm doing, particularly because it's not on the page yet. So I definitely do that first.
I've been doing this for a while, and so I sort of have a a number of elements that are important to me. One of them, of course, is the purpose of the logline, which is to use as a selling tool. At the end of the day, you want your agent or manager who's going to be talking to studio executives to correctly communicate what it is that he wants to send over, right? And so sometimes you don't necessarily fully trust your agent or manager to convey it the way you want it conveyed. So if you craft a logline for them to use, then you've already put your best foot forward because you know it's got your stamp on it of how it will be communicated over the phone or via email or what have you. So as a selling tool, this is your last chance, because once that script goes into a studio, some reader, some story analyst is going to do coverage on it. They're going to write their own log line, and you just best hope at that point that it's, conveys what you had in mind. But in the early going, you're basically trying to come up with a way that you can test your idea, and then you're using it as a sales tool for your agents to use. But the elements that are important are obviously the protagonist. You want to convey early in a log line who this could be as an actor. Because the representatives, the studio executives, the folks that will be reading this log line, that's one of the first things they think is there a role for a movie star? Because sometimes, like for example, let's say you wrote this $150 million tentpole sci-fi movie, an original idea of your own, and your hero is a 16-year-old girl. Well, that might make for an interesting screenplay, but there are no A-list 16-year-old movie stars. They don't exist. So you cannot put in the lap of a studio executive a project that he or she cannot market because there's no role for a movie star in it. So you have to think that stuff through. So it's very important that when you create your protagonist, that you have casting in mind, because at the end of the day, you're trying to sell this thing. So you want them to be able to envision the movie that they will market before they even contemplate buying your script. Also, I think it's important to talk about world. World is more important nowadays than ever, with the entree of all the Marvel movies or Black Mirror on television or Game of Thrones. It's become an essential part of a lot of storytelling is a sense of world, where you literally create a time and place with characters and backstories and mythologies and all of these things that suggest to a buyer, once again, we're trying to sell a script, there could be opportunities for spin-offs, for franchises, for secondary characters, and all of these things, because there's a world. And once you've planted the seed in their mind that there's a world to your screenplay, then they are more inclined to see the opportunities, which is what they're here to do, is make money, right? And sell product, sell content. So we're trying to help them help you, right? And the logline is a way of doing that. Another thing I always think is important is to clearly suggest tone and genre. You don't want anybody to be reading your logline and thinking that your stark drama is actually a comedy, or vice versa. The words you choose are critical in that, right? Because if you, like I always say, if it's an action vehicle, you want to talk about a heist or an operation or what have you. But if it's a comedy that has similar things going on, you might talk about hijinks or antics, right? Totally different words that convey the same thing, but it's clear. This is a comedy. This is an action movie. So your words are critical to how you convey what you're trying to say.
I don't think a vague logline helps a writer, right? It's great for an audience. I mean, I can understand not giving away a story to an audience if the audience are the paying customers. But from inside the process, if it's the writer's room, if it's me inside my brain, I have to know where we're going. Otherwise, how can I chart the journey? Similarly, for if I'm selling a project to somebody, and you're the buyer, you're Warner Brothers or whoever, you've got to know, if you're going to pay me money to allow me to write this and help create it, then you have to know what you're buying. So I shouldn't, the same sort of mystery that I play out with an audience should never be, I think, the mystery that I'm going to play out either with myself, my collaborators, or somebody who's going to buy the property, because they need to be on board. They need to be on board with the journey. And so, Yeah, so all things can be revealed in the inner circle, but then with the audience, then I'll hold some things back so that they can enjoy the journey.
When I was in grad school, I wrote 2 romantic comedies before I realised I'm not very funny. And I don't know that world, and frankly, I wouldn't see them. So the dean of the school at that time, at graduation, came to me and he said, okay, so your professors all have really good things to say about you, that you're talented, you just have no idea who you are. I'm like, what does that mean? I don't really know what that means. And he said, well, think of it this way. You go to a cinemaplex and it has 18 theatres in it, right? And each one of those theatres has the best of every genre. Which one do you go and see? I said, well, horror thriller. He goes, well, why are you writing romantic comedies when you wouldn't even go and see them? I don't understand. I was like, well, that's when I came up with the idea, that was the genre it best fit in. He's like, but you wouldn't go and see that genre, which means you don't really want to see what you're writing on the screen. You wouldn't go and see it. Write what you want to see on the screen. Thus, my horror fascination came out in full force, and I started writing that and developing that. But I think you have to understand who you are and what you like to see, not just what you like to write or what you think the audience is looking for, because I guarantee you by the time you finish the screenplay, they're already looking for something else. And you saw that in the found footage craze, right? Everyone started doing found footage movies. Well, they weren't selling. So no one wants to see that anymore 5 minutes later. The industry changes that quick. So I think as a writer, you do have to write what you love. You write what you would go and see, you know. I wouldn't go and see romantic comedies necessarily. So why am I writing them? And I think that was the best piece of advice with regards to the question you just asked that I could have got.
I do always say that to my writers, is that your idea of your story is never the whole story. It's not that the idea is incorrect, it's the idea is incomplete. All right, and so being a writer, being a story, being an artist is humbling because you're not the author, you're the channel. And so when I'm working with writers, I'm really speaking to their higher self. I really believe that your subconscious is the seat of your genius. And the genius is not a noun, it's a verb. It's something we all have access to. And so you have to let go of your idea of your story. You have to let go of your ego. Because as Einstein says, you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. Every story begins with an apparent dramatic problem, all right? But you can't solve it at the same level of consciousness that created it. So what you've got to do is you've got to let go of this idea of what the story is in order for the truth of the story to emerge. The story is not about what happens. It's about the meaning we ascribe to what happens. So I'll give you an example. So let's just put Oppenheimer aside for a second. Somebody asked me years ago, one of my students, they said, "You're always talking about meaning. What are you talking about?" I said, well, I'm going to tell you a story right now. I just made something up. And now this is the stupid example I always give. I'm going to make up a story. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, but it will be bereft of meaning. So a woman comes home, says to her husband, we've been married 20 years, I want a divorce. Husband quits his job, gets on a plane, flies to France, goes out to a carrot farm. The farmer rushes out, hugs the man, and together they open a carrot juice restaurant called Carrot Juice Charlie's. I just told you exactly what happened. Doesn't mean anything. So now here's the story with meaning. Woman comes home, says to her husband, we've been married 20 years and you're still a stranger to me. The man quits his job and flies to France, which is the last place he saw his father alive when he was 8 years old. He goes out to the carrot farm where his father dropped dead of a heart attack. The farmer, who was the father's best friend, rushes out and hugs the son, still distraught over his inability to save the man, leaving the boy orphaned. Together, they open a carrot juice restaurant in honor of the boy's father, whose name was Charlie, and they begin the process of healing. So it's not what happens, it's the meaning we ascribe to it. I can't tell you how many writers I work with that will say, they'll say, well, my character would never do that. And my answer is always, well, if you have an impulse, if an idea comes to you and you dismiss it because you think your idea is your character wouldn't do that, you're actually cutting off the channel. Your job as a storyteller, I believe, is to support what your subconscious gives you. I can't tell you how many times I see second acts start to flatline because we get so attached to our idea of how the story ought to go that we disconnect from the truth of what the story wants to be.
Everything that I write that's original comes out of some inner obsession. So something I am freaked out about or obsessed with or afraid of or that I can't stop thinking about. There's always some core kernel of interest that comes out of that space. So even, one of the examples that I often use, and I haven't written anything about this, is for whatever reason, like I'm not a coffee drinker, but I know a ton of, almost everybody is a coffee drinker. So if I go there, if I start with that kind of, the question underneath that for me would be, why are people so interested in this thing that I'm not interested in? What does that mean about me? What does that mean about them? And I can mine that into perhaps a story about how valuable coffee is. Perhaps it's contraband in a world where coffee is rare. Perhaps there's somebody who doesn't like coffee who's hoarding this substance, right? So suddenly I begin to brainstorm something from this obsession that starts to manifest into a big question and then a character, and then who is that character? And then who is that character up against? Who is the person who's trying to get the coffee from this person? And suddenly, my brain is populating with all these ideas. And then I will solidify the character, solidify that antagonist, make clear decisions around what they're trying to do, and maybe there are other things they're up against. Maybe it's illegal to hoard the coffee and the police are involved, I don't know. But then I will create a logline from that and begin to sort of sketch out the beginning, middle, and end, and then start using index cards to think of brainstorm moments. And then I'm off to the races. Then I'm sort of into the space of outline from that kernel of an idea.
But basically what it really comes down to is the important thing is to think in scenes and write a written version where you are writing down the scenes in a list. That's what an outline is. An outline is a list of scenes. Some people can do it on index cards. They even have index card software where you can put a lot on it. I believe that the important thing is to understand that you are breaking a story into scenes, and that when you have your full list of scenes and you know what everything is going to happen in every scene and there's nothing missing, then you're ready to write. So that's the importance of an outline. The actual form of it, it's whatever works for you. I believe that the most important thing, the thing to put in that first line, the headline of each outline step, is not where it takes place or even what happens. It's what is the essential action, the point of the scene. So the point of this, like we were talking before about a scene where Maya gets fired. The point of that scene is that Maya gets unfairly fired. You try to make things active, always try to put things in active form. So Maya gets fired is actually passive. She's getting fired. The scene actually is Tommy fires Maya unfairly. Now, for me, that's a scene line because I know exactly what the action is. And I try to always break it down to that. Sometimes, I'm the only one looking at it. Oh, that's the other thing. Outlines should be for you. Outlines are not to be read by other people. It's a workspace. It's a workplace. If you have to do an outline for another person, that's a performance. You should copy your outline and then write a version for other people to read. But for you to work in an outline, the important thing is that you're doing whatever will trigger you to understand the point of the scene. Sometimes I know a scene so well that I'll just write, Joe drives to Dallas. Now, I know that during the course of that, he has to have a breakdown, but it doesn't matter. I know what that means. But really the scene is Joe has a breakdown while driving to Dallas. The important thing is the central
action of the scene. And while there may be many steps in any scene, there's usually one thing more than anything else that scene is about, and that's the point of the outline. Then for me, underneath it, I'll put everything I can think of. I'll write dialogue in my outline. I'll do whatever I can, because I can always just cut and paste it out later. But that space under the headline is where you can ask yourself questions. And I write them in a different color. I write, why is Joe having a breakdown? How do we know that Joe is having a breakdown? And then I'll answer it. And I'll describe, maybe I'll say like he crumples up his hamburger and smashes it into the rearview mirror. Whatever it is, I'm trying to get everything I can into the outline so that I will know what it is when I write the scene. Those outline descriptions can be very long. They can be arguments with myself. The most important thing to do, though, is break everything into a scene. There's nothing that is going to go into your script that isn't in a scene. So the whole point of an outline is to get you to remember, if I don't have a scene where that happens, if I don't have a scene where that subject is raised or that feeling occurs, it's not going to be in the story.
I think for me, the beat sheet comes after I've done my, I'll do my brainstorming on index cards. So I will, I'll have a log line. The log line always suggests, what my beginning, middle, and end are going to be. I'm a big fan of Sid Field's description of dramatic structure. And he talks about how, there are these, in every story, there are two plot points. He calls them plot points. And one is the moment that takes us from the beginning to the middle, sends us into the conflict. It's an event that as he says, spins the story in a new direction. So, and then on the other side of the conflict, there's what he calls plot point 2 that spins the story into a new direction, but this time toward a resolution. So the first thing that I do when I'm coming up with a story is I will put those events, those two plot points, on 2 index cards. One index card for plot point 1, one index card for plot point 2, which, that's the beginning and ending of my conflict. And then I'll just say to myself, well, what else needs to happen? What needs to happen before that moment? What needs to happen in between, in the heart of the conflict? What needs to happen toward the end? And I just start writing on index cards and almost stream of consciousness. Well, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. And I'll just keep making cards, as many as I can, until I run out of ideas. And I'll put them in order. And then once I have them, I'll go through and I'll separate out, I don't think I need that, or these two are the same, or, right? And then once I have those, then I'll start to, if I'm satisfied with the order and what is a loose structure at that point, I'll put those moments in a document, one after the other, and that's my beat sheet. This will happen first. This will happen second. This will happen third, and then I'm creating basically a list of actions that are going to take me and the character through the entire journey of the script.
First of all, a beat sheet is something that you never show to anybody else that you don't trust. So you never show it to the producer. If you're hired to write a film, you never show it to the producer or the director. You only show them the finished product. But the beat sheet you can show to your trusted advisors. Now it can take many forms because you're writing it for yourself. You're writing it as a guideline for yourself. So when I write a beat sheet, I'll write a sentence or two, but sometimes I can visualize that whole scene and I will write a paragraph. And then the next beat, maybe I'll only write 2 words. He goes to the bathroom. Well, that's 3 words, or 4 words. Maybe the next paragraph, the next beat after that is something that is another paragraph. The next one is just 2 lines. So it can be whatever you want it to be, whatever guides you through the process of the film, the structure of the film. That's what a beat sheet is. What I ask my students to do is to write 2 lines, but if they get carried away and write 3 or 4 or 5 or 10, that's okay too. But at least 2 lines. A beat sheet should generally be about 3 pages single-spaced, but it doesn't have to be. It can be 5, it can be 1, it can be 10, whatever works out for you, for your story, whatever you need to write for that story, so that you have the story in a form that you can then take and write the script from, or write the treatment from, which I think is the recommended for a new writer. Definitely write a treatment. And that gives you the opportunity to stop and think, okay, I've got this beat. This person has to ride their bicycle downtown. What happens when they're riding their bicycle downtown? And I think it through, and then I write the paragraph or 2 paragraphs that are needed for that, and I write that in the treatment. Or if I'm jumping from the beat sheet to the script, I still work out the whole scene in my head, and then I write the scene in script form. And the beat sheet has 3 elements in it. Each beat has 3 elements. Who's there, where they are, and what's the conflict. So each beat should have those things in it, and my students understand that, and they are able to discuss, okay, I understand where they are, but why is it only him there? Why isn't he with somebody else there? It would be better if he were talking to somebody rather than having a monologue there. The conflict is the central issue of every scene. If there's no conflict in the scene, it's not a scene. It's leading up to a scene, or it's leading away from a scene, but it's not a scene. So each beat should be a scene, so it should have the conflict, should be clear. What is happening in that scene? Now, as long as we're talking about conflict, we should talk about what the beats represent. If the beat does not move the story forward or tell us something about the central character, then we don't need that beat. If it's just a funny scene, but it doesn't move the story forward, sometimes they'll let it in a comedy, but most times they won't. They'll cut it if it doesn't move the scene, if it doesn't move the story. If it doesn't tell you something new about the central character or the antagonist possibly, then we don't need it. It doesn't help us. We can take it out. We can have it, the story will flow without it. And that's how you figure out if we need that scene. If we take that scene out, we're not sure about that scene, we take it out, and the story still flows without it, then we don't need that scene. If we take it out and the story does not flow, if there's something missing, then we put that scene back in, but we make sure we add conflict in that scene. Otherwise, it doesn't hold you. If there's no conflict, you're not held by that scene.
I think often they have challenges crystallizing the conflict. They'll know that it generally has to do with liberation or, looking at their life, a character's life in a new way. But they won't necessarily say it's really about, this person struggling to, free themselves from a bad marriage. Like they'll be more general than specific usually. And then we have to sort of nail it down. Okay, great, I get the notion of liberation. How does that manifest? What's actionable about that? Like, what are the scenes we're gonna see? Because we can't just see a scene of liberation, but if we talk about a marriage breaking up, or if we talk about somebody moving away from home, suddenly I can see scenes, packing a bag, getting on a train, getting money, running away, making phone calls, calling a lawyer, like suddenly I'm into action space. Sometimes I have to invite people to step into more specifics in order to be able to, get an actionable, dramatic circumstance going.
If you are interested in storytelling, you may also like our new book, Story Questions, the sponsor of today's video. It's a story tool that offers you over 1,500 story questions that you can use as story prompts. It's packed with over 40 categories, so whether you are in the brainstorming stages, developing characters, dialogue, or rewriting, it can help you at every stage of the writing process. Think about this statement. Most powerful stories are just great answers to strong questions. We've linked up to story questions in the information section below.
It's a million times easier if you kind of know what the character wants. But there's always a starting point. You think you know what they want at the beginning and you start writing with that, and then it can shift, And so I think it's the most important thing. Like I said earlier, when I do consultations with people, it's the singular most popular problem in the script is what do they want? How are they trying to get it? What are they doing to try to get it? How does that make them face something in themselves, and how do they grow? And do they finally get this thing, or do they get it in a way that they didn't expect? So I think I always try to start out like, what do they want? Because I've learned over the years, like, I need to know what that is, because that's the engine that drives their actions through the story. And when I don't know that and I start to write, I'm just kind of like just driving over here, I'm driving over here, I don't know, it ends up being, I throw out a lot of pages. So I think you can start like, what is their emotional need? Do they want love? Do they want revenge? What is it that's driving them? And then what's the specific thing they think is going to satisfy that need? And how do they pursue that? And you may start with that and you may shift it. As you start to write, you realize, oh, that's not what they want at all. They want this other thing. So then you're gonna have to go back and kind of, reverse engineer what you did. But it's okay. That's the process, And a lot of times characters' goals shift in the movie. Like in Get Out, which is a great movie, Chris, he wants to go impress her family. In the middle of the movie, his goal shifts to like, I need to get out of here. They're gonna hijack my body and my brain, right? So that shifts in the story, but that's good, that's okay, but he still has a goal throughout that drives him. What if you can't figure out what the character wants? Again, a very common issue, right? Some strategies that you might do to try to figure out what the character wants is to figure out what they're afraid of. What are they afraid of? Like, what are they scared of? And what do they want that's in contrast to that? Could their want come from wanting the opposite of that fear? Do you know what I mean? If they're afraid, let's say they had a traumatic past or a traumatic childhood, could they really want just the perfect family? Could you start from fear and generate a want as the opposite of that? That's one way to kind of try to generate some ideas about, what your character could want. One thing that I often do with my clients and my students is I have them write a monologue. And monologues in movies we're not supposed to write monologues. It's one of the rules. But you know what? This exercise is actually really helpful. And what I ask them to do is to sit down and imagine their character is in a room with someone else in the movie that they trust, another character that they trust. And that other character says, "What do you want?" And this character tells that other character what they want. And I ask the writers to use all their 5 senses to describe this dream that they have, and just to allow that character to talk to the writer and describe what they want with no preconceptions. And usually and I say write for 5 minutes and don't stop. So just stream of consciousness, I want this, and somewhere in there is a kernel of something that they can actually grab onto and hold on to. So again, giving an invitation to your character to speak to you about what they want. They have to listen. They aren't listening. They're trying to put things on the character. If you step into the character and let them talk, they will tell you things, So let them tell someone else in the movie what they want.
What are the 3 worst ways to start a story?
I think one of them is not identifying a main point of view or a main character. And I've seen it where you linger for 10 to 15 pages of the setup before I even meet the main character. I think that's hard to pull off. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think that's one area where starting a story without really introducing our main character can be really fraught with danger. I think writing too big an action sequence in the beginning, you leave yourself nowhere to go. I know a lot of action movies do start that way. And I think also, if I was to identify another bad way to start a story, is with too many characters. I see that quite often, is that it's very hard for me to discern who the main character is if in the first 10 pages you've introduced 10 to 15 characters. It's like, I don't know who I'm following. Whose story is this? It becomes muddy. So I think that starting a story off with too many characters who have too many things to say, especially minor characters, can be confusing. and really takes us away from, okay, who are we following and who am I going to empathize with and join on this journey? I think that's one way you wouldn't want to start a story. I think another way is, if it's a horror movie, starting it with some kind of comic sequence, not a good idea, unless it's a horror comedy. So I think getting the tone wrong, or setting up the wrong tone for your movie, especially when you're wanting it to be a sci-fi, but in the first 10 pages you don't introduce any elements that would exist in a sci-fi world. You wouldn't want to start a movie that way. And starting a movie that's too talky. Too much dialogue in the beginning of your movie doesn't allow an effective setup of the tone or the world, quite often.
I want you to imagine that we are in a classroom at UCLA. So you're in a classroom with me, and I'm teaching, and I get a phone call, and I get this terrible news that my brother's been in this really bad accident, and he's in the emergency room at the UCLA hospital at the base of campus. And they have to operate in 20 minutes or he'll die. He has a rare blood type. They're out of that blood type. But he has a medical emergency bracelet that says, contact my brother Corey, he has my blood type. So Corey, you gotta get here in 20 minutes or your brother's gonna die. Okay, that's pretty meaningful stakes. And let's say in this scene, my goal is I gotta leave the classroom like in the next 20 seconds so I can get to my car and I can get to the hospital and I can give blood. So just to keep this simple, in this little short scene, my goal is to leave the classroom in the next 20 seconds. And oh my God, if I don't do it, my brother dies. But what is in my way? What stands in my way? A chair. Oh my God, there's a chair in my way. Now, I think you would say, that doesn't seem like a very good conflict design, because that seems kind of easy. You could go around the chair, you could go over the chair. You don't know me, I can't go over a chair, but I could go around the chair. I could move the chair. I'm not limber enough to go over a chair, but anyway, I can deal with the chair and leave. So I had a goal, I had meaningful stakes. It was just too easy. So let's make it harder. Let's put 2 chairs. Let's put 3 chairs. Does that make it more interesting? Not really. Let's put a human opposition. Let's say there's a complaining student and they're like, Corey, you can't leave. The class still has half an hour. And I'm like, my brother's going to die. And they're like, well, people die all the time. I want to be a writer. You can't. And at some point, look, I love you, but hey, I'm sorry. And I kick the chair out of my way and off I go. Has that made it more interesting? I think so. Has it made it interesting enough to make a studio reader want to keep reading? No, it's not that. It's a little more interesting. It's not that interesting. So let's make it even harder. And now let's assume, let's have fun and say this is like a Quentin Tarantino script. So there's always the threat of stylized violence, and you're in the mood for that. And so I explain in the class, I gotta leave, my brother's gonna die, oh my God, the chair in my way, complaining student, okay, just kick the chair, and then bam, there's a gunshot, what? And there's that student in the back that everyone knows is wired a little bit, and they've got a gun, and they shot it, and they put the gun at me, and they're like, I hate your brother. And you take one step towards that door, I will shoot you, I will kill you, and they mean it, and I know they mean it. Now, assuming this is tonally appropriate and it makes sense, you know, this is like a Tarantino type project, and you care about me, and you care about my brother, this could get your attention. This is now getting to be rather interesting. Here's what I want you to take away from this. When I had to leave the classroom in 20 seconds, and what stood in my way was a chair, 2 chairs, 3 chairs, did you know, could you confidently figure out how this is going to resolve? Yeah, I was going to leave. You didn't know how I was going to deal with the chairs, but you don't really care. When there was a complaining student, did you know how it was going to resolve? Yeah, you were going to go out the door. I don't know what you were going to do about the complaining student. That was a little more interesting than a chair, but you were going to leave. Now, Quentin Tarantino version, gun pointed at my head. Do you know how that's going to resolve? No, you don't. So let's do the math. So part of what I can teach you in the modern story tools is Deep Heart of Darkness, which is required to get people to really care about the character. So let's say you really care about the character, and the character is trying to accomplish something, and it really matters to you how this plays out. And suddenly it looks so difficult, you don't know how it's going to play out. What does that make you have to keep doing? It makes you have to keep reading or keep watching. And that's why conflict is so important. The chairs were an inconvenience. I'm sorry, let me repeat that, or let me rephrase that. The chairs were obstacles. The complaining student was an inconvenience. The person with the gun was opposition. Opposition must rise to the level that we have no idea how things are going to play out. So many writers use a mixture of chairs, complaining student, and person with a gun, and that's why they're amateurs. Doesn't mean you have to have a gun. I mean, in the class, or you can see examples your own. There's lots of strong opposition that doesn't require a gun. It's anytime you're watching something and you're like, oh my God, I have no idea how Fleabag's gonna get that priest to sleep with her, or I have no idea how this guy is gonna, in The Bear, Carmy's gonna get this guy to give him the meat at half price. Like, you just don't know, but it matters to you. It makes you have to keep watching. I'll tell you a true story. So I was in film school and a friend said, hey, there's a screening, you wanna go? And I'm like, yeah. Jumped in the shower, ran out, got in her car, and off we went. I didn't even know what the screening was for. That's the great thing about film school. It's like movie summer camp. Someone's like, there's a screening, you're like, I'll go. Now I'm like, what's the screening? Where is it? What is parking like? Can I get some food? But back then I'm like, screening? Let's go. So it was a Coen brother movie. I didn't know that. Who was sitting 2 rows behind me? Joel and Ethan Coen. After the movie, Joel and Ethan went up and they took questions and they were talking about their process, and they said something that just blew me away. They said, when we were starting out, we wanted to be writing like the strongest conflict. We knew, when nobody knows you, you got to write the best script to stand out and get noticed. So when we would put our character into a real jam, we had a rule. If we could figure a way out for the character in less than a week, we wouldn't use it. Like when you're watching Breaking Bad, Walter White gets into a jam and he's got 5 seconds to figure it out, and you're playing along at home like, I would die, no, that wouldn't work, I would die. And then at the last second, Walter White does something and you're like, oh my God, that's brilliant. Walter White's brilliant. Walter White's not brilliant. There were 19 writers that took 3 weeks to figure that out. Walter White had 5 seconds to figure it out. So they said, if we could figure out a way out in 6 days, we didn't use it. And I just remember going, whoa. I didn't realize writing could be that hard, but that is brilliant. But then I was suspicious, like, is that true or are they exaggerating? Like, I'm gonna find out one day. And about 2 years later, I was at a party and Ethan Coen was there, and I went up to him and I was talking, and like, you probably don't remember me, but 2 years ago I was at the screening, blah, blah, blah. And you guys said the thing about the opposition, and I said it. He's like, yeah, I don't know if he remembered or not, but he's like, yeah. And I gotta ask you, like, is that really true? Like, did you really not use anything? I just gotta know, was that really true or did you kind of exaggerate? And he just kind of looked at me and he said, what do you think? And he smiled and he walked away. I'm like, so I still don't know. But I shared this story with my students, and I've had students saying, I'm gonna do that. And they have had a lot of success. Now, I'm not saying that you have to hold yourself to this standard. You can, but what I am saying is, don't use chairs and don't use complaining students. Go back through anything you've written and be honest with yourself, or have someone else read it and have them be honest with you. There's a really good chance that at least 1 or 2 places in your script or more, the opposition doesn't rise to the level if we don't know how this is going to play out. And if that's true, that's where people stop reading. So this could really make a difference.
Scene work is interesting because when we talk about scene work, all we really need is a character, or we need more than one character, but the character needs conflict. So we want to keep our characters in as much conflict as possible. And there's a film I always bring up to my students and I make them watch it over and over again, because Little Miss Sunshine carries the torch of scene by scene of hitting conflict, shifting power dynamics, which is also another word for shifting status. I feel like that comes up more in TV shows and TV scripts, the shifts of status. And it's so powerful that when we see it in a movie, it's pretty cool. So when I'm rewriting a scene, I go over who has status in the scene, and then is there a way to play with it? So I'll do an example of a cop interrogating a suspect. So there's a cop, and he's interrogating there it is, a cop interrogating a suspect. And the cop has high status, and the suspect is in handcuffs. The suspect may even be crying, and the suspect has low status. So when you're watching a scene, think about power dynamics and think about status, because that's what actors are thinking about, and that's what writers are thinking about when they're writing, and actors are thinking about that when they're playing together. But we can shift that dynamic, because so let's say in the same scene, the suspect has information that the cop wants. So then the cop realizes this, and maybe the suspect smiles, and the cop slams his fist on the table, and he's upset as the suspect is not giving him this information. And all of a sudden, the suspect has higher status, and the cop has lower status. The cop wants something from the suspect, and needs something from the suspect, and the suspect isn't giving it up. So when you're watching films, keep an eye out on the status and power dynamics, and watch how the protagonist can go in and out of high status and low status in scenes. Like here's the example of Little Miss Sunshine, when we're introduced to Richard. Richard is talking about his life coaching, I forget what, it's like 5 principles for being the amazing man you are meant to be. And he's commanding the stage as he's, eyeing the crowd and going over his presentation. And then the camera turns around and it shows us how many people are in the audience. And there's like maybe 10. And he gets a tepid applause. So the director gave us a power dynamic shift. We thought we were seeing a very high status person almost talking to a stadium of people. And then we realize he's low status, and it's practically a conference room, and no one really cares what he's saying. It's a lot of fun, and that's when Richard goes back down to low status. Refuse to lose. That's what it is.
Right.
The 9 concepts.
Conflict is critical when you're trying to write dramatic fiction, because it exposes the character's truth. If, for example, let's say my goal is to dramatize for the audience that a woman loves her son, her young son. Now, I could show them walking down the street together, and they could, I love you, honey. I love you too, Mommy. Well, I guess I've done it. I've communicated the information. But if I have them walking down the street, they stop for a moment. She stops to chat with the passerby, and the little boy, she looks around and he's suddenly gone, and she's frantic, and she starts rushing from store to store to see if anybody's seen her son, and yelling, and pulls out her phone to dial 911, and she's bursting into tears as she tries to explain. And then she looks up and she sees him standing at a toy store window staring in at the toys, and then she rushes up and hugs him. Now I have dramatized how much she loves him. I have shown it. I have made the audience feel that she loves him. If I simply say it, I've communicated the information in a way, but I haven't made the audience feel that information, and that's my job as a screenwriter, as a storyteller, again, is to make the audience feel something. That's the contract we made. So that's the distinction. The distinction is conflict. I created a conflict of the child being missing. Without that conflict, it's just people talking. As a storyteller, you have to lean into conflict. You want to make your characters go toward conflict rather than away from it. I say make them, I don't mean that the character has to take steps that are deliberately self-destructive. I mean, you want to construct the story so that it moves into the darkest, deepest, most powerful conflicts possible, because that's what the audience wants to see. Otherwise, what are we doing here? We should just do a documentary or write an article about him as opposed to dramatizing his life. Conflict is how we show the character's truth. And so the more the better. In fiction, we don't like it in real life, but in fiction, the more the better.
Storytelling cheats. I'm glad you asked, because I have some notes about
Oh, great.
storytelling
Okay.
cheats. If you want to, feeling sympathy for a character, some ways to get right to feeling sympathetic. Blake Snyder wrote the book Save the Cat. So that's a way to get sympathy immediately. Save a cat. Here's another example. Let's say a mom's just trying to clean the house before her in-laws arrive. Have her step on a Lego. Have her step on like a tack or a nail. When we do something with the palm of the hand, when we cut the palm of the hand or the bottom of the foot, as we're watching it, we've all experienced that pain, especially on the foot. The bottom of the foot hurts so bad.
Right.
And it immediately gives us an emotional response where we're like, we've been there, we've done that. So that's an element to add to a scene. If we look at Minority Report, in Minority Report, everyone is scanned by their eyeballs. And so when Tom Cruise is on the run and he's wanted for the future murder, he has to get rid of his eyeballs. Just that idea alone brings massive conflict. And so think about what you can do with the eyeballs. Can you touch the eye? Can you poke the eye? Through that whole operation scene of Minority Report with Tom Cruise, we're like losing our minds.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And then if we go back to Little Miss Sunshine, there's a lovely thing that the writer does, which is he gives Dwayne the vow of silence. Dwayne didn't have to have that vow. I don't know what draft of the script where the writer went, you know what? Because the writer of the script in early drafts could have just had Dwayne upset and mad at his parents, and it would have been fine. But he has a vow of silence, and it escalates his tragedy. So when he finds out he's colorblind and he can't become a pilot, I think he wants to be a pilot, and you can't be a pilot when you're colorblind. When that plot point happens, that's the first time he speaks. And when he speaks after he hasn't been speaking throughout the whole film, we pay immediate attention. So it's symbolic on so many levels. And the other thing about Little Miss Sunshine is the VW van situation. Just make the VW van only start in second gear. What a fantastic story device, because it makes the family push the van, and then they all have to jump in the van. So there's danger involved. There's the family just being disgusted they have to do this, and it's a device that brings us to the very end of the film. It's a device because they hate working together when this happens. It's drudgery through the film. When they've come together in the last scene as they push the van through the parking lot, they're pushing the van as a family. All of a sudden we see them as they've all kind of been reborn into becoming a family. And so watching them push the van is a whole new experience for us and them.
So in Act 2, some people call this the fun and games place. I call it the trial and error place. I look at it like, this is your recipe. This is your, I want to bake a cake. How? Step 1, do this. Step 2, do this, right? So in Act 2, we're actually watching the character try to achieve the goal, successfully or unsuccessfully. So being able to see them actually take physical steps towards doing that thing is what we're watching. Now we're going to start putting in the complications, and I like to call it complications and not conflict, because people see conflict and they go, just add some negative something, right? But a complication is something that's very specific to stand in the way of the goal, right? So they're going to start coming in contact with things that are hindering them from getting what they need, things that are redirecting them, things that are causing them to hit rock bottom. And then you need a midpoint, and your midpoint sounds like what it is, right? Happens kind of in the middle of your story. It doesn't have to literally be on page 45 of the 90 pages, but it's gonna happen somewhere around there. And it basically means that something big enough happens to cause that redirection. Either I'm gonna hit rock bottom, or I have a false victory, or I receive some information that changes my goal. So I believe I gave this example, I've given this example before because it's the easiest one for me. If my goal was to find my kidnapped child, at the midpoint, I'd find out that my kidnapped child has already been killed, right? That doesn't mean the story is over though, because we're only at the midpoint. That means my goal has to change. So now my goal is not to find my child. My goal is to find the killer, to get revenge, to get justice. And so for the rest of the screenplay, we're gonna watch the parent do that, right? Instead of looking after the child. So the goal changes. Something causes a redirection. And then some people look at the climax as what happens at the end of Act 2. Some people look at it as what happens at the beginning of Act 3. Either way, it's in the same place, in my opinion. So you're also going to be getting your character up to the point where they actually are face-to-face with that goal or face-to-face with that antagonist so they can win or lose. So those are the biggest beats. They need that trial and error time or fun and games time or, steps to their recipe time. They need those complications that get in the way of that so they can grow, so they can redirect. They need that big moment, whatever that midpoint is, that causes a new goal, makes them redirect, makes them hit rock bottom. So someone has to come in and re-motivate them. Right now, your mentor character gets to come in and give a speech or whatever and get them going. If you're watching an episode of Grey's Anatomy, that's the moment where it's like, I found the new cure, right? At first, we thought we'd never be able to do this surgery. Oh no, we didn't do well. I found this new thing. And now for the rest of the episode, they're gonna do the new thing until they win or lose, or save the patient or not save the patient. And then you'll go up to the climax, which is where they save the patient or not save the patient. So those are the beats that you're looking for in Act 2. This is where you know they don't know structure. This is where you know they haven't figured out what their story was before they got to the page. Because this is where Uncle such and such shows up. This is where this is the goal, this is the story, and the writer is doing this. Because they don't know what the goal or the story is, or they don't know how to get to Z from A. And maybe it's because they're just a new writer, so they really just don't know how, or they don't understand structure. So they're doing all of these other things to get to Z, but none of those things connect. Going back to cause and effect, none of those things connect. So that happens quite often. And I think that's the biggest thing. Sometimes there is no midpoint. Depending upon what kind of story it is, what the tone is, what the genre is, the midpoint doesn't have to be something huge, but it's, bigger than your other trials and tribulations. So sometimes people are missing that thing that gets us over the hump. Because once we get into Act 2 and you get into those trials and tribulations, if it's take a step, fail, take a step, fail, take a step, fail, by the time they're doing that the fourth time, I'm no longer invested. You know what I mean? I need something that's going to change this thing to get us going in the story. So it goes back to, having that friend or cousin who's really great at telling stories, right? They know how to hook us in, make us think that this one thing is happening, and then take us to the next thing, right? So that midpoint kind of gets us over that hump of they've been trying and failing or trying and succeeding, and here's something that's going to change this whole thing for us so that the pacing can kind of start to rev up and we can get to the climax. So a lot of times that's missing. Also, the climax is missing, but more so in television pilots that I read than in features. It seems like feature writers kind of understand a little bit more that there needs to be this high point. In TV, because people are thinking about the series, and if you're writing a pilot, then you're creating a world and characters that people can be invested in. They sometimes forget about the structure of it and forget that, but we're still telling a story, so we got to get up. Right? And so a lot of times that's missing. And so if you're writing a half-hour single camera comedy, that means, or a dramedy, then you have 3 acts. So your climax is going to happen at the end of Act 2 or at the top of Act 3, depending upon how you write it. If you're doing a 1-hour drama, and let's just stay in the 5-act place, because there's a 4-act that exists and a 6-act, whatever. Let's stay in the 5-act place, then it's gonna happen at the end of Act 4 or top of Act 5, depending upon how you write it. So a lot of the times in TV, it never makes it to a peak. It just kind of stays here the whole time. And no matter what stories you're telling, pilots, features, even if you're writing a spec and you're doing an episode of something, we're looking for stories to do this. We're on a roller coaster. So we don't want to spend our whole time like this. We don't want to spend our whole time like this. We don't want to spend the whole time like that. We have to have all of it happening. If not, it's not a fun ride and no one wants to get on it. And by the time Uncle, Gus is done and you ask Uncle Gus, so what happened? He probably wouldn't even tell you the same story if you asked again, right? Because he's just talking about everything and doesn't know, his point, his end goal, right? Or he gets to the end goal, but we're all lost because none of the stuff between when he started and the end goal made any sense because they're not connected. Everything has to be connected, right? And the other cousin knows how to make A connect to B, connect to C, connect to D. Uncle Gus is saying A, G, E, M, and it's like, wait, but what happened to B and C and D? Like I'm missing something. Like give me this other information. And he's cracking himself up. No one else is laughing because we missed the joke. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's that kind of stuff that starts happening.
Storytellers have been using labyrinths for thousands of years. A labyrinth is a maze that may be circular, it may be square, but it has passages that always have a singular goal, and that is to move you towards the center. Now, just as we see in the hero's journey, it's one thing to get to the center of a labyrinth. However, we have to get back out. And so there's one journey that takes us to the center of a labyrinth, and there's an entirely different journey sometimes that will take us back out. We encounter the labyrinth at different times in myth and history, and the first very popular labyrinth story is about Theseus and the Minotaur. And of course, the Minotaur is waiting at the center of the labyrinth for Theseus. And those of you that like the story of Theseus or are familiar with the myth know that in order to help Theseus get back out, Ariadne ties a ball of yarn, or ties yarn to his foot. So as he ventures through the labyrinth and makes it to the center of the labyrinth and defeats the Minotaur, he then can find his way back out by tracing the yarn. There's a number of things about this story that I think are compelling to us as humans, but also it becomes an archetypal story in and of itself, and that I think we keep telling this story over and over again. We could even say it's a certain version of the hero's journey, traveling to the center of the labyrinth and then having to bring the boon or the defeat of what's at the center of the labyrinth back out of the labyrinth. Now, why is that significant to us? I would suggest that is significant to us because it mirrors the process of all of us going inside of ourselves, defeating that which may lie at the very center of ourselves, and then finding a way back out to live in the world with others. This is a constant process. Carl Jung called it the individuation process, how we fully become ourselves. But the labyrinth, the maze, it speaks to this mystery of internal work, an internal journey. And it puts it in a physical space. It's interesting that we see the labyrinth not just in history and myth, but we find the labyrinth in physical spaces. In France, there's a beautiful cathedral in Chartres, and this cathedral has an amazing labyrinth on the floor, still to this day. It's a Christian church, and yet at the center of the labyrinth, we see an image of the Minotaur. It leads us to believe that perhaps this idea is something common to religious traditions and experiences of spirituality throughout history, throughout time, across geography. That maybe there's something in walking a labyrinth that allows us to experience something that we can't quite put into words. Maybe there's something connected to that ritual that connects us to that which is beyond. The power of walking the labyrinth became so profound at different times in history that people who were unable to physically go and walk a labyrinth would be given the opportunity by tracing the labyrinth on a wall with their finger. There was a recognition that there was something powerful there that may not be something that we fully understand or can put into words, There's actually been a resurgence of people walking labyrinths, both in this country and around the world. And they can't always put their finger on what that experience does for them. Maybe it's as simple as this. Walking the labyrinth mirrors the journey of walking through life that we have. And compressing that into a small space, into a small time, a small experience, it affords us the opportunity to try on a micro level to create some sense of meaning or some sense of understanding that we don't always get as we travel through the much larger labyrinth of life. Mazes and labyrinths often get used with the same descriptors, and in many cases people say they're the same thing. However, there is an important difference in a maze and a labyrinth if we look at the technical descriptors that make one thing a maze and another thing a labyrinth. A labyrinth has passages that lead to the center, and that is always where we will end up. A maze will have dead ends that sometimes we can't find our way forward and we have to return back the way we came through. A labyrinth will always have a way forward where a maze will have dead ends. This, of course, is important to recognize that in life, we often are stuck in a maze, but we're looking and hoping for a labyrinth. There are a number of myths that bring up labyrinths and mazes. However, labyrinths seem to have a greater presence in mythical stories. The story of Theseus, of course, is the most known and the most famous. However, it is not the only myth that has the involvement of a labyrinth. To go outside of the Western Greek tradition and to even perhaps predate some of that, we see within the Hindu tradition this idea of what was called the thread spirit. And the thread spirit, in many ways, was manifest in a spider's web. And if you think about a complete spider's web, it looks a lot like a labyrinth. So there were a great deal of conversations or people interested in the spider's web perhaps being something that was sacred, especially because the entire spider's web comes out of the spider itself. It comes out of the spider's body. And the spider and the web end up having a lot of presence within mythological stories. Perhaps my favorite spills over from Hindu traditions into West African mythology, and it's the story of Anansi. And in West African myth, we find Anansi the spider constructing this web, this labyrinth that he hangs stories upon. And Anansi in West African myth was also responsible for convincing the gods to give humankind stories. The gods kept all the stories in the world in a large box, and Anansi tricks the gods into pouring the box out on the world, and the stories are given to human beings, and Anansi begins to put the stories on the web. Now, what do we take from that? Well, we begin to see perhaps there's some relationship between the labyrinth of mystery and finding our way through and the various stories that are associated with different parts of the labyrinth. Maybe this story gives us insight into navigating this part of the labyrinth, and this story gives us insight into navigating this part of the labyrinth.
but the stories are connected to the labyrinth, which is connected to the mystery.
So the biggest error is, I think screenwriters forget that screenwriting is writing. It's words on a page. It's really important that you either put words on a page, read words on a page, rearrange words on a page. That's what you're busy doing. You're actually writing. You're not directing or creating a movie. You're writing. And that's the biggest misconception, I think, around screenwriters, is some people think it's like, it's in the movie industry, so it must be fun and glamorous. It's writing. It's words on a page. And so having said that, some of the feedback around that is particularly words on the page related. So one of the first ones is, there's no such thing as a house. And what I mean by that is a lot of students or first-time writers will go exterior, house, day. And then they'll say, Frank walks into the house. And I'm like, what house? What does the house look like? Is it a double-story house? Is it a mansion? Is it a ramshackle house? What is it? Words on the page, house. You got to tell us what's in your brain, otherwise a casting agent, a location scout's going to go find a location, and that's going to be your house. So there's no such thing as a house. And there's no such thing as a park. There's no such thing as a car. So often in the first draft or first-time writers will go exterior, house, day, and I want to say to them, just please be just suburban house or Dave's house or something. And then in the action sequence, do a little description. One, not a lot, please. Small little description of like a ramshackle, apartment, or if it's exterior, house, day. You can use house, but I wouldn't, because it's going to get complicated when they start doing a schedule. I would call it Sam's house or Danny's house or suburban house or something like that. But then in the description, tell us what's in your mind. We're not mind readers. And I think a lot of the time writers, when they're writing, they think they're going to direct the show or something, and so they don't tell us. But just a little description of what the house is going to activate the camera in the audience's brain, and they're going to see what's in your brain, and that's where the communication starts happening. And so there's no such thing as a house. I think they think because they can see it in their head when they're writing, the reader can somehow, through osmosis, pick up what they're talking about. And I'm like, no, we can't. So no such thing as a house, and there's no such thing as a man. Like a man walks down the street. I'm like, what kind of man? Is he a tall man? Is he a short man? Please, what's in your brain? And this actually comes down to semiotics, and this is why it's words on the page. It's like a tree. We know in semiotics, the idea is like if you say there's a tree, you're all picturing something different. And everyone watching this, when I say tree, you're picturing something different. So if you say there's a tree going in the garden, if you're not specific about what kind of a tree, you are not going to see your vision enacted in the way that you want. So be specific, but very importantly, without overwriting. So you can't say, there is a lush green tree that has many leaves and roots in the ground. Just tell us it's a citrus tree, or a stunted tree, or a leafy tree, maybe. Trees are all leafy. So again, it's where language gets specific, right? But it's use your words on the page to make sure that the reader activates the camera in their brain and sees what you're seeing in your brain. And that's why no such thing as a house, no such thing as a man, no such thing as a tree. Be specific without overwriting. One of the things that I see coming up a lot is, and it can be summed up in this thing, is the order that we read is the order that we see. And I keep saying this to my students because it's very important. Again, it's about words on the page. Is that if you write a sentence like, I'm going to use Frank again. Frank's in this movie. Frank is sitting in the lounge, or Frank sits in the lounge eating his breakfast. The telephone rings, he picks it up, and then suddenly another character enters the scene, and doesn't enter the scene, but just you write dialogue where like Dorothy says, who's on the phone? We're like, where did Dorothy come from? I didn't see her because you didn't tell me where she was in the scene. You need to say, unless you want us to be totally surprised by Dorothy suddenly appearing and saying who's on the phone, you have to say, Frank sits at the table, Dorothy next. So you're activating the camera in our brain. By the order that we're reading is the order that we're seeing things in our brains. So it can be applied even more more effectively if, for example, if you do a scene that's, say, set at a market, and you say, exterior farmer's market day, and you can say Frank walks through the stalls, fruit sellers sell their wares, an orange rolls down on the floor from one of the fruit stands, Frank picks it up. You've taken us through an order. Our camera in our brain has been activated in order. Now, the power of this is you can change it around. You can say, Exterior farmer's market day, an orange rolls on the ground. Fruit sellers sell their ware. Frank walks through the rows. Frank picks up the orange. You've changed everything around because now we're seeing the orange, then we're seeing the fruit sellers, then we're seeing Frank, then we're seeing him pick it up. It seems really simple, this, but I see a lot of students and first-time writers getting this wrong, where they don't pay attention to the power of the words on the page and how this takes the order that we read is the order that we see. And you can just have such fun with that because then you're pretty much directing on the page, which I know we're not meant to. You don't say close up, long shot, wide or anything like that. But the order that we read is the order that we see. It's just important to remember. And I think it comes from writers having the scene in their head so clearly and then trying to get it on the page, still having it in their head, but not quite getting it on the page the way it is in their head. And that's always the trick, right? Getting it in your head onto the page in a way that mimics what's in your head. So
I always believe everyone should write backwards, but by that I do not mean you actually start in the last scene and write backwards. I mean, know the ending. That's really what write backwards means. Write backwards is a crucial thing because until you know the ending, you don't actually know what your story is about. For instance, if you're telling a story in which someone is trying to save their sister from lions, then whether or not they actually do save their sister and how they do they do it by overcoming their fear of lions, or do they do it by learning lion language and telling the lions to stop? That's going to be what the story's about. And until you know that last thing, the thing that resolves the tension, you don't really know how to write anything else. So work backwards really means know your ending. Once you know the ending, everything else makes sense in a different way because you know that it's an obstacle towards that or a step towards that.
The climax is kind of everything. It's so important. In some ways, it's what the story is. Stories can start in lots of different places, but they really can only end in one place. And they tell us what the whole story was about. So if you don't know your climax, you don't really know your story. You just have a premise. The climax is the answer to what this was all about, or it's the beginning of that. And so people come to me, I have private clients as well as I do this in my classes. They filled out their nutshell technique form. They're all excited about it. We're going through it. And I'll tell them, I'm not going to be attached to anything you say, really, until I hear your climax. You can tell me what the character wants. You can tell me the character's flaw. That's all good. But I'm flexible in my brain until I hear a climax. Because if you don't have a climax yet, or if you don't have a good one, we're going to stop. I'm going to stop right then and there. I'm going to talk with you because you don't know your story yet. We got to figure that out. And so, the definition of a great ending is that it's inevitable yet unexpected. This is attributed to Aristotle, but it's not certain that he said that, but whatever. It is, a great ending is inevitable yet unexpected. That's a pretty tall order, by the way, but that is our goal as writers, is to find an ending, and when we say ending, we really mean climax, find an ending that is inevitable yet unexpected. So when you see a movie that has a great climax, ideally, you never saw it coming, right? That's the unexpected. Once you see that moment, you can't imagine the movie any other way. That's the inevitable. So it's a very tall order. It is not an easy thing to do, but it's so important. And again, I strongly believe you don't know your story if you don't know your ending. So here's my best advice about how people can find their inevitable yet unexpected climax. Right before the climax, you want to have your protagonists should be at their crisis, their lowest moment, and they should be between a rock and a hard place. This is really important. It needs to be a rock and a hard place. Can't be a rock and a soft place. If it's a rock and a soft place, well, we know they're going to pick soft place. Or if they don't pick soft place, it's not going to make any sense to us. Why wouldn't you pick soft place if that's an option? It has to be a rock and a hard place. Two bad choices that they can't see a way out. We can't see a way out. Now, as we begin the third act, the climax is the first thing in the third act. What are they going to choose? Are they going to choose rock? Are they going to choose hard place? No, they're going to choose, and I'm going to give you a really important technical term we use in my classes. They're going to choose banana. Banana. It's not a rock. It's not a hard place. It's not even a mineral. It's a third choice you never saw coming, right? So that's what it needs to be, a third choice we never saw coming. Now, it's a third choice that we never saw coming, but it can't come out of nowhere. If it comes out of nowhere, then we'd call that, Deus ex machina, like, God machine is the term from the Greek, where, basically, something magically saves the day or comes along. It needs to be a moment. It tends to be a light bulb moment. The character, that's why it's unexpected. They didn't think of it before. They need to think of it. Only when we get them rock bottom, and you've taken away all the good options, can they come up with this moment? So it's a light bulb moment, and it's typically, it's going to involve sacrifice. They can get, they get not what they want, but what they needed in this moment. So they're not going to they're going to give up the thing they really thought they wanted or something like that, in order to achieve the greater good. So they may sacrifice their freedom, but they're going to get the deeper thing that they needed, the more profound thing that they needed. And so this is a big step away from their flaw and towards the strength that they're going to have in the end. And really it's everything. It's, that's the moment everyone paid their money for. That's the moment, that's why people are in the theater, to see this moment. And it's not just because that moment should be exciting and fun. It's because emotionally, it's incredibly exciting for us because we didn't see it coming and we can see the change that is happening. And so it's important and it's so critical to telling the story. So again, if you don't know your climax, you don't know your story. One caveat I want to mention is something called schmuck bait, which I love the term, I think, because I love saying the word schmuck. But schmuck bait, where the choice is, you're telling us that someone is, that the princess is going to die, and only a schmuck would believe that the princess is going to die. That's one usage. And then another version of schmuck bait is when it's just a really unbelievable choice that they make. That, again, only schmuck would believe that they're actually going to do that. So watch out for that it's not schmuck bait. You really want to, and it's hard. It is really hard to find that banana. But that is so important, to find that third choice we didn't see coming, but make it one that we're going to believe, that doesn't feel like schmuck bait, a deus ex machina. Let me give you one example that I see so often. I cannot tell you how many people have come to me with a story that is falls under this somewhat broad description I'm going to give you, where a person has to choose between an object, some sort of material object, something involving money, or a loved one, a family member or a love interest. Gee, what do you think they're going to choose? They're going to choose the family member, right? I saw it from the beginning. I saw it coming the moment you told me the setup in the beginning. So that is your task as a writer, is that you have to find out a way where I don't see that choice, right? It has to be a third choice I don't see. So either you're going to change the choices to something else or destroy one of the choices, but you don't want to put yourself in a corner where you told me it's, these two choices and they're just going to choose one of those two choices, and I'm gonna know it. I'm gonna see it coming from there. So just to be aware of that, of setting up, finding a way to set it up so that it's a third choice we didn't see coming. Maybe there's a different option, or maybe you frame it so those weren't the two choices in the beginning. Because ultimately that's everything. It also shouldn't be an easy choice. It can't just be like they found out a piece of information about the trust. It has to put them in a bind, right? If it's an easy, you don't want it to be easy where they can just say, well, this is illegal and call the police and save the day, right? That's not a surprise. You want to make it so they can't call the police, that they can't, that it's going to be hard, right? That they're going to have to figure out some other solution. They're going to have to make a compromise, or they're going to have to try to trick the bad guy, but in a way that is a true risk, not just something they could have done all along to save the day. It's something in this moment that they're going to take a chance on, that could fail, that has consequences, and that also they're going to lose something. They can't just do a banana is not save the day. It is try something incredibly risky that I'm going to lose things, and I'll lose maybe the respect of my family or the public, because I'm going to confess to the world I was part of the scheme, but it does the greater good of bringing the bad guys down, but I'm also bringing myself down. The idea is the crisis is what happens at the 75% mark. And what we want to see is that the protagonist they will have gotten their want earlier in what happens at the 25% mark, but they're going to grow to hate the thing that they want. And so by the point of the crisis, they want the opposite of what they wanted in the beginning. And so what we're doing is we're setting up a really profound reversal, is that the character's going a full 180 degrees. The thing that they most coveted in the beginning, they now despise. And that that also contributes to their crisis, the fact that that's a low point. They don't know what to want in life. They're lost. This thing, that very often the want is something they've built their whole identity around. And now, they've decided they despise that thing. And that puts them at the rock bottom. And that's followed immediately by the climatic choice. The climatic choice is back to back with the crisis. That choice comes out of the rock and the hard place that is at the crisis, right? So the crisis is their lowest place. They now hate the thing that they want, and they are stuck between two bad choices. And so what are they going to do? They're going to make a choice in the climax that is neither rock nor hard place, right? It's going to be banana, because they're now going in a new direction. They've never even considered this direction before. They were single-minded before about the want. I want this. My whole life is about this. And they've now are empty at the moment of the crisis when they realize that it isn't the most important thing. And they don't know what they want next. And they have to make a choice related to that.
For me, the heart of a good story is its instruction. That is, in order to be a good story, it has to have a message. It has to tell me as the reader or the viewer what I'm expected to do based on this information. To take an example, that would be a bad example. Liar, Liar, Jim Carrey movie Liar, Liar. Jim Carrey thinks it's okay to lie and finds out you have to tell the truth. Person watching that movie says, oh, maybe I should tell the truth too. That's an instruction. The theme of the story, tell the truth, is the instruction that the viewer or the reader receives. For my money, it ain't a good story if it's not driven by an instruction, because otherwise it has no purpose. It's just there to be entertaining. You could even look at something like Hangover, which looks like it's just entertainment, but there's an instruction. The instruction is stand by your friends. No matter how bad things get, stand by your friends. So the story is informed with purpose. What does it mean to be a good story? That's the first thing. Story has to be informed with purpose. You have to be telling the story for a reason. It needs to have, this sounds self-evident, a beginning, a middle, and end, but it's self-evident, but still needs to be done. To me, a satisfying beginning and middle and end is an arc of change from denial to acceptance of the theme. So for me, a good story will be one about someone who starts out opposite to where he ends up or she ends up and takes a journey that's meaningful to get there. To be a good story, it needs to have stakes that matter. There is an expression of mine. The truth is revealed under pressure. If there is no pressure in the story, there will be no impetus to arrive at truth. The character will not change. The character won't be forced to change. For this, we can look at Star Wars. Luke wants to be a Jedi Knight, wants to be out there in the universe fighting bad guys, whatever. If the if the Imperial soldiers never come to his little planet, put him under pressure, he's never going to change. He's going to live his whole life there and we're never going to hear about him. But because he had to run for his life, he was put under pressure, he could start to transform. And transformation is the heart of the story. The story goes from beginning to middle to end across an arc of transformation from denial to acceptance of the theme being the instruction that the author wants the reader or the viewer to acquire. So that's what makes a good story.